Okay, so without much further ado, I'm just going to jump in. What I want to present first is that the title of this talk was The Lives and Times of Garab Dorje. And the reason why we're calling it The Lives and Times of Garab Dorje is because, well, there's three different namtars basically of Garab Dorje. But before we get to that, there's many people who have doubts about the historicity of various characters in Dzogchen literature, and they don't. And oftentimes you hear people trying to prove somehow that this sort of what we call Chikcharwa, or instantaneous realization tradition is somehow comes from Chinese Zen, and the fact that there was a confluence of Chan in Dunhuang, as well as Indian Vajrayana Buddhism, which was in Tibet at the time. And while it's definitely true that there were Chan masters in Tibet, and it's also the case that there was a Chikcharwa movement in India. And we know this for a fact because there's an Indian author who dates from the mid 10th century, named Manjushri Kirti. And he wrote a text called the Sri Sarvaguya Vidhi Garba Alankara. And in that text, he's describing different intellectual movements in India, largely describing the difference between one set of adherents who discuss their idea that Buddhahood comes from practicing the creation stage. And so that's one side of things. And the reason why they maintain this is because in order to be a Buddha, you have to have all the major and minor marks. And so they argue that if you don't practice the creation stage, you don't create the causes for major and minor marks. On the other side, we have a bunch of scholars who basically argued that the creation stage, the completion stage, was really all you needed to actually practice, and that the creation stage, which was just there more or less to make sure that Hindus didn't think that we were nihilists, that is Buddhist practitioners, and so on and so forth. And for people who believe that Buddhahood arises through dependent origination, like the Sakyas, for example, or people who are terrified of the profound meaning. And what's very interesting about this list of authors that Manjushri Kirti gives who support the second notion, that the completion stage is what is actually necessary for Buddhahood, is one of those authors is named, one of those people is Sri Singha, whom Manjushri Kirti identifies by name. And the second person that Manjushri Kirti mentions is Gelong Magamo, who is mentioned as the teacher of Guru Padmasambhava, and also in the Semde histories, Gelong Magamo, that's a Bhikshuni Nandi. She's also mentioned to be Vimala Mitra's teacher of Dzogchen in the Semde lineage. So this is very interesting that we have this confirmation from a 10th century Indian author about this community of practitioners who lived in India who are advocating a Chikcharwa point of view. And this really has not been discussed very much. I have to confess that I didn't really know about this passage until a scholar at Columbia, a guy named Tom Yarnell, was doing a presentation on Tsongkhapa's Nakrim Chenmo. And he produced this citation as being very interesting because what Manjushri Kirti, of course, is arguing for is the unification of the creation and completion stage together as being necessary to produce all three kayas. Now, of course, we realize that in Dzogchen, they don't really have this idea. For example, Rongzom Chokyi Pandita in his introduction to Mahayana systems basically argues that if you think you can understand, quoting the Diamond Sutra, the famous Vajra Chedika, if you think you can see the Buddha by virtue of characteristics, you haven't understood anything at all. The classic perfection of wisdom point of view about the Buddha characteristics and so on and so forth. So at any rate, the reason why I introduced this is because when we're trying to establish the lives of Garab Dorje, the one historical figure that we know absolutely without doubt existed in the whole lineage of whichever lineage of Dzogchen we're talking about is Sri Singha. Sri Singha is like the central person that all Dzogchen lineages go through. So actually, in one way, we can consider that because Sri Singha was the guru of Padmasambhava, the guru of Bhikshuni Nandi, the guru of Vimlamitra, and the guru of Vairochana, in some extent, we can't ignore Sri Singha, and I understand that Professor Fabian Sanders is going to do something on Sri Singha a bit later, which is very good and interesting because there's also a number of questions about Sri Singha as well. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on Sri Singha. I just want to point out that we need to understand that Sri Singha, according to the Vajra Bridge account of the Longde system, was a contemporary of King Trisung Detsen, which places him in the realm of Sri Dharmapala, who is an Indian king who lived in Bengal, and his reign was roughly from 770 to 810. So he was also contemporary of King Trisung Detsen's. So when, there's two ways we can go with this kind of stuff. We can either spend our time talking about sort of the magical mystery tour of Namtars and these kinds of things, which is fun. But many of you have read Jim Valby's account, which comes from the Menakte tradition of Garab Dorje and Manjushri Mitra and so on and so forth. And some of you are maybe a bit familiar with the account of the Semde lineage in this book translated by Ani Jimpa, The Great Image. I want to talk about the Great Image in a moment. So really what we're trying to do here is I'm trying to identify for you what are the interesting themes that we find in common with these three different accounts of Garab Dorje's life. And so it's very difficult to pin down Garab Dorje in historical time. But of course, we have this date that Norbu Rinpoche, Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, has presented to us, and his date is 55 AD. Now, when we talk about histories of Garab Dorje, there are three main traditions. There's what we call the Semde tradition or the Mind Series tradition. There's the Longde tradition, which we find in a text called the Vajra Bridge, written by a 12th century author named Kunsang Dorje, who was a direct descendant of Zeng Dharmabodhi and Zeng Jose. And he actually wrote this text, the Vajra Bridge, for the reincarnation of Zeng Jose. And that Tulku Usel, this may be is the first person we actually know of in Tibetan history who's identified positively as a recognized reincarnation. And of course, what's interesting about this is that normally we say that the Tulku system starts with Karma Pakshi, declaring himself in the 13th century to be the reincarnation of Dusum Khenpa. But in fact, the earliest known Tulku that we have historical evidence of is this Nyingma Tulku in the Longde lineage. So when people understand this, they should understand something else about sort of the origins of the Tulku system and how far it goes back. And what is also interesting about the Longde lineage is that they were very closely associated with Zeng Dharmabodhi was not only a student of Padampa Sangha's, but he was also a student and a teacher of Gampopa, and he exchanged Longde teachings with Gampopa for Mahamudra teachings. They both were teacher and student to each other. So so this is a possible reason why the Tulku system actually starts in Nyingma school, but then it quickly spreads into the Kagyu school within about 100 years, or less than that, maybe 50 or 60 years. Anyway, so when we're considering the story of Garab Dorje specifically, now, in terms of Norbu Rinpoche's date of Garab Dorje as being 55 AD, one of the interesting things so let's just clarify what we're talking about here and what I'm referring to. I'm drawing from three separate texts, well, four actually, if you consider the Bairo Gyudbum, but there's not much information there. The first text I'm drawing from is a Terma text which was produced in the 13th century by the partner of a Tibetan named Guru Choang, and her name was Jomo Menmo. And Jomo Menmo revealed this biography and account of the Semde lineage and Vairochana's adventures in India, and of course his trials when he returned to Tibet, was exiled to Gyalmo Sawarong, and was eventually sort of readmitted into the Tibetan court after experiencing some number of years of exile. And the broad outlines you can read in Ani Jimpa's book. One thing you have to understand about Ani Jimpa's translation of the Great Image is that the Great Image, as that's been translated, and I believe it's a Shambhala book, yes. The Great Image that was translated by Ani Jimpa is a 19th century compilation of a broad array of different sources. And so Dharma Senge, who also wrote a major book on Machik Labdhan, he mentions in the colophon of that book, and you can read it, where he says he was drawing together different sources, and Jomo Menmo's original text was way too profound to just translate straight because it had so many interesting citations. So what Dharma Senge did was he basically wrote a hagiographical novel of Vimalamitra, and using various different sources, he kind of tried to flesh out what was originally a fairly sparse outline. Not only did Jomo Menmo reveal a terma of the Drabak-Chenmo, or the Great Image, as its great mask, literally, but also Dorje Lingpa in the 14th century, a few years, maybe 30 or 40 years later, he also produced a terma of the Drabak-Chenmo. Plus, there are a number of so-called Kama accounts connected to the Semde lineage. One of those we find at the very beginning of the Bairo Gyudbum. It's the first text in the Bairo Gyudbum, and it's a very sparse outline of the Semde lineage and all the Semde masters that are included there. So that's the first source I'm using, is Jomo Menmo's version of the Drabak-Chenmo, which is the Namtar of Vairochana. The second source I'm using, as I already mentioned, is the Vajra Bridge history written by Khunsang Dorje. And there's three of those. He wrote a long one, a medium one, and a short one. And what that is actually a commentary on one of the, on the main Longde Upadesha. Not the Longde, if you've taken any Longde teachings, you know that there's one text that Vairochana wrote on Pang Mipam Gompo's Tungshing, his like little stick that he used to hold himself up. Not talking about that Upadesha, that's a separate text. The Upadesha that the great Vajra Bridge is based around is the core Upadesha that was written by Vairochana. And so what Khunsang Dorje did was he wrote a big history that he gave in three different versions, a large one, a medium one, and a small one. So you have to kind of read all three together because he includes different details in each one of these three histories. It's an Enigma Kama edited by Dujum Rinpoche. And then the fourth source that I'm using is, of course, the Lokuchenmo, which was written by the Tertan of the Vima Nintig named Shang Tashi Dorje. Shang Tashi Dorje was a student of Chegom Nakpo, and Chegom Nakpo was the main student of Chetsen Senge Wangchuk. And Chetsen Senge Wangchuk was the main student of Dhamma Lungyal. Dhamma Lungyal was the Tertan for the 17 Tantras and all of the related literature. So I'm going a little fast, but I understand that they're going to upload this so people who are interested can review things, because I have to go fast because I have many things I have to say in a very short period of time. So the reason why I decided to focus, rather than just, sort of fill your ears with like, Garab Dorje riding on dragons and bears and lions and tigers, which you can find in Jim's translation of this text, what I wanted to present you with some very interesting comparative elements of these three namtars. So first of all, we'll just start with the one that people are most familiar with, which is the Lokuchenmo biography. And because I think that one of the reasons why the Menakde account of Garab Dorje and Vimalamitra and Sri Singha took off is because it's in a way, it's a lot more interesting. It has a lot more details about who Garab Dorje was, and a lot more drama, a lot more Mahasiddha adventures and these kinds of things. There's just a more compelling narrative, frankly, than the The Longde one is kind of compelling. It's interesting, but the Semde one is mostly focuses on Vairochana. It doesn't really focus so much on Garab Dorje, but they have to mention Garab Dorje. Now, in the Lokuchenmo, another interesting thing about the Lokuchenmo is it identifies how long each of these events happened after the parinirvana of the Buddha. So whether we take the date for Garab Dorje's birth at 55 AD or 80 AD, which is my preferred date, depends really on when you think that Vimalamitra went to Tibet. Because the Lokuchenmo states that Vimalamitra arrived in Tibet 180 years after the parinirvana of the Buddha. So if we, in Western dates, we think that Vimalamitra more or less arrived in Tibet in 800, actually after Trismegistan passed away. There's some evidence that they never actually met. But anyway, whatever you think, but if you put it back 25 years, or so, and then you wind up with 55 AD. So Garab Dorje's birth, according to this account, was either in 80 CE in the Common Era or 55 CE in the Common Era. Just depends upon when you think when you think Vimalamitra arrived in Tibet. Because in this Lokuchenmo, in this biography, in this great chronicle, that's what Logu means, chronicle, because Lo means year, Gyu means continuation. So Logu, and so many people say history, whatever. I like chronicle because a chronicle actually literally is an account year by year of what happened. So in the Lokuchenmo of the Vima Nintig, Shang Tashi Dorje basically gives us these dates. So we know that, for example, that Garab Dorje, according to these, he lived from 880 CE to 344 CE before he rainbowed out and came back and gave the 3 words of Garab Dorje to Manjushri Mitra. So that gives you an idea of his lifespan. And what it says in the Lokuchenmo about Vimalamitra is that Vimalamitra was 300 years old when he arrived in Tibet. And then he departed from China like 10 years later or something like this. Of course, then we also have a conflicting account in the Samten Migdran by Nubchen Sangye Yeshe. And Nubchen claims that Vimalamitra never left Tibet and that he died in Tibet. So we also have these anomalies between all these different accounts. So based on this, we have some idea of when Garab Dorje may have lived according to the Menakde tradition. Now, one thing when we look at this sort of material, we have to be cautious about an account which is written in, the 12th century, describing events that happened 1,000 years earlier, even 300 or 400 years earlier. We have to be very clear that it's very likely that people are going to describe things in terms of what they understand in their own contemporary period. And so, for example, a good example of this is Homer's Iliad. So there's a lot of descriptions of the lifestyle of Agamemnon and the heroes that went to Troy to go rescue Helen, who'd been kidnapped. But when we look at the details of how they're living and everything, it's very clear that they're writing about 6th century BCE Greece, and not about 1200 BCE Troy, and so on and so forth. So we find a similar thing with Tibetan Buddhist accounts of ancient history, and particularly since Tibetans are living in Tibet and Indians are living in India and various other places, there's likely to be some lack of correlation. Now then, so we have there are places in which all 3 accounts agree, and that's interesting. All 3 accounts agree that Garab Dorje was born in Odiana. All 3 accounts agree that his father was a king. All 3 accounts agree that his mother was a nun. All 3 accounts agree that she immaculately conceived. And that's about it. That's about the only place where they all agree. They all only agree on these bare facts. There was a country called Odiana. They don't agree, by the way, in which direction Odiana was. According to the Semde lineage, Odiana was to the east of Vajrasana. Generally speaking, Odiana is considered to be to the west of Vajrasana, that is Magadha, Bodh Gaya. So the Semde account places Odiana to the east. The Longde and Menakde accounts place Odiana to the west. So that's a difference between these three accounts. The second difference is that in the Semde lineage, we have the king being named Dahenatalo. Now, Dahenatalo is actually the third master in the Dzogchen Semde lineage. Garab Dorje Manjushri Mitra I, then Dahenatalo, then his son Rajahasti, then the princess, the Garab Dorje's mother. She's like the fourth in the lineage. Then in the Longde lineage, he's identified as being Shakya Zangpo or Shakya Bhadra. That's the name of the king in the Longde lineage. So we have a completely different name for the king in that lineage. And finally, we have not even the real name of a king. In the Menakde lineage, he's only identified, the king is only identified as Uparaj. And Uparaj is not a name. Uparaj is a title. In fact, in the Longde lineage, may be aware of this fact, Kunzang Dorje actually distinguishes between a Dharmaraj and an Uparaj, and basically says a Dharmaraj is someone who cannot possibly commit any non-virtues. That's why they're called a Dharma king. But an Uparaj is merely a protector of the realm. And so it's possible, actually, that Kunzang Dorje was, implicitly criticizing this account that had been written by its contemporary Shangten Tashi Dorje, because they lived at the same time, and these lineages existed side by side before Menakde eventually took off and became most popular. Now, one thing I also want to point out here is that even though they all say that they all of these places are from Odiana, all mention Danakosh, in the Semde lineage, Danakosh is actually a city which is on a lake. And that lake is called Kukrakala. I know we have no idea where that lake is anyway. And anyway, they say it's in East India rather than in the northwestern part of India, in the Semde lineage. Then also again in the Longde lineage, it actually says that Odiana is actually really quite close to the ocean, and that Dhanakosha is actually an island off the coast of Odiana on a salty ocean. So this is a completely different presentation of this idea of where Dhanakosha is. And you have in this idea that we're really now talking about basically Pakistan itself as being Odiana, and Dhanakosha in the Longde lineage is an island where Garab Dorje goes to practice, which is actually out in the ocean. And then, of course, we know that basically in the Menakde lineage, Dhanakosha is an island in Odiana, and that is where King Uparaj lives with his wife, who's named clearly Illuminating Light, or it's I forgot the Tibetan off the top of my head. But anyway, that's not the most important point. Only in the Menakde lineage do we have a name of the mother of the grandmother of Garab Dorje. So moving on to the next important element. The next important element is that the princess's name in all three accounts are different. So in the Longde lineage, she's called Paramitra, but if you read Ani Jimpa's book, there she's given the name Parani. Then in the Vajra Bridge account, her name is given as Sarani. And then in the Menakde account, the Lokuchenmo, her name is given as Sudara. And then if we look at the Pandrup, there's a text in the very first text in the Biography is called the Pandrup, Panditas and Siddhas. And her name is given there as Paranila. So we have now 4 different names for this one princess. Then finally, not finally, then we continue on to actually Garab Dorje himself. So before we can talk about Garab Dorje, we have to talk about how Garab Dorje came to be. Now, in all three stories, that's the common element that I forgot to mention. In all three stories, Garab Dorje's mother conceives, and he's born of a virgin birth. So no father. And this is actually a kind of a problem in the Longde and Menakte lineages. This is kind of a problem for the princess. So, but we have to understand first how it is that Garab Dorje is conceived. So in the Longde lineage, there's a very interesting story. And basically what happens is that Princess Paramitra, she has a dream. And in that dream, the sun enters her crown and the moon enters her feet. And then she understands that this is a prodromal sign that that there's something strange is going to happen. Then what happens is that after she wakes up, she goes out and she's in the morning, she's relaxing. She faces this lake that she's living next to, which is because Danakosh is on the shores of this lake. So then 5 swans land on this lake. 4 of them take off, but one of them goes and kind of hugs Paramitra with its wings, kind of gives her a big hug with its golden wings. That's what the text says. It's very beautiful. And then taps Paramitra on her chest 3 times and plants inside of her chest a golden 5-tine Vajra. And then, of course, we know that 5 months later, Garab Dorje is born from her heart, actually. That's what it says in the text. Now, this is sort of interesting. This is kind of a little reminiscent of Leda and the Swan. Who knows? All these stories were floating around the ancient world. Maybe it's possible someone heard about this Roman myth and they decided to apply it to the Sunday lineage. I have no idea, but it's suggestive. Then in the Longde lineage, there's a very interesting account where basically she encounters a turquoise cuckoo. And as we know, of course, we have the Rikpa Kujuk. And Sri Singha gives this Rikpa Kujuk to Vairochana, and the reason why he calls the text the Rikpa Kujuk is because just like as the cuckoo bird heralds the arrival of spring, so too the Rikpa Kujuk is going to be the first Dzogchen text which Vairochana is going to translate into Tibetan from the language, whether it's language of Odia or Sanskrit, we don't really know. So she sees this cuckoo, and this cuckoo says cuckoo 3 times, and she understands that now something amazing is going to happen. And then that night, in her dream, the emanation of Vajra Sattva, in this text called Sudachita Devaputra. Sudachita Devaputra visits the princess at night, and they make love, and then he departs, and of course then she's pregnant, and then 9 months later she has this child. And then finally, in the case of the Menakte lineage, she dreams of a white man with a vase, and in this vase is written Oma Hum. And the way she gets pregnant in the Menakte tradition is that he puts this vase on her head, and then she wakes up pregnant. Now, this is all very concerning. And in all 3 stories, the princess is kind of freaked out that she wakes up pregnant. You know, she's kind of miserable and unhappy because she's afraid that everybody's going to think she's just like a complete slut, and she's not protecting her vows, because the other common feature in all of these stories is that she's a fully ordained nun. So, like, for example, in the Longde and the Semde history, she's also got like 500 nuns hanging out with her. So you know that there's going to be a lot of questions asked about how is it that this celibate nun became pregnant. This is a major feature of the story. Also in the Menakte, she's also celibate nun, but she's living more or less alone with a Dakini attendant who figures in that story. I'm sorry, I can't sort of like give like a sort of a blow by blow, point by point, because then we would be here for hours. But I can sort of cover these elements in kind of a brief way. And then so then basically what happens is that so she's pregnant. Now in the Semde version, she only remains pregnant for 5 months. But in the long day and the Menok day, she remains pregnant for the normal 38 weeks that a human woman would be pregnant for. Now, what's very interesting about the Semde lineage is that when Garab Dorje was born, he emerges from her heart, holding the golden Vajra, and reciting, chanting the Dorje Sempa Namkhai Che, which is of the 5 early Dzogchen people who are students of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche know this obviously. The Dorsem Namkhai Che is the longest of the 5 lungs that was brought by Vairochana to Tibet. And also Norbu Rinpoche commented upon it very extensively. And in some accounts, it says that Garab Dorje proclaimed this when he was 8 years old. But in this Jomo Menmo's account specifically, it stated that he was chanting the Dorsem Namkhai Che as he was being born, which is a very interesting. Then another difference is that according to the Semde and Longde traditions, Garab Dorje had to receive transmission. So in both cases, in one case, he receives transmission from Vajrapani, who basically says, well, in the Semde tradition, he says, you received already all of these lungs and intimate instructions and transmissions when you were Deva in the Deva realm before you took human birth. But here, what I'm going to give you is a golden staff, which symbolizes the fact that you have actually received all of these transmissions previously. And then based upon that, Garab Dorje is said to have understood all of the 9, what they call the Logu, the 9 dimensions. That is, starting with the Tawa, conduct, etc. There's this presentation of, it's common to all series of Dzogchen, of 9 spaces. In the long day, he is given transmission by ostensibly the person who is his father, Sudachita Devaputra. Same idea, except for here in this case, the transmission is given symbolically. So in the long day tradition, Samantabhadra says to Vajrasattva, ah. And then in the Vajrasattva says to Garab Dorje, aho. And then Garab Dorje says to Manjushri Mitra, aho hei. So the symbols become a little bit more and more, plus like a statement, which means look into the center of space, etc., like this. So the long day lineage is very interesting because it explains these different methods of giving transmission. Not only that, we're very familiar with this idea of this Gyawa Gongyud, Rigzin Dagyud, Gangzak Nyengyud. Well, one of the interesting things is in Jomo Menmo's text, there is the lineages are actually named differently, which points to a kind of an earlier tradition. Now, there's a scholar named Jake Dalton, and in his thesis on the Anu Yoga Tantra Dupe Do, he mentions that these 3 lineages are a very important part of the Anu Yoga system. Here, though, the names are a little bit different. So we have this Gyawa Gongyud, that's the same, but then we have this Rangi Ngogyud. That would correspond to the Rigzin Dagyud. And then we have the Nyenkun Gyud, which means ear. It's just like Nyenkun, Nyenkun, I think. Anyway, it means ear to ear, literally. And what's interesting about this is that you have the Gyawa Gongyud, the sort of transcendent state transmission of the victors goes from Samantabhadra to Vajrasattva. And then this Rangi Ngogyud, this sort of lineage of intrinsic nature. This goes from Vajrasattva to Garab Dorje. And then everybody else after Garab Dorje is oral lineage. Oral meaning A-U-R-A-L, a hearing lineage, heard from one ear to the next ear. So this is very different. This is different than the sort of standardized Gyawa Gongyud, etc., Rigzen Dagyud. This notion of Gyawa Gongyud, Rigzen Dagyud, Gangzak Nyengyud, this is very much characteristic of the Lokuchenmo and Menakte. So one of the things that's hard to understand about early Dzogchen history for many people is that the Tibetans that later, they basically decided that, particularly Longchenpa, decided that the Menakte history, that was the best one. This is it. This is the one we're going to follow. All the other ones are provisional because after all, Menakte is much better than everything else. And, since it's better than everything else, then there's not much point in reading these other things, because this Shamtung Tashi Dorje's book was considered to be definitive also. Like I said, it was more interesting. Another thing that's interesting about this is that prior to the Lokuchenmo was written prior to the Zonglingma, and also the that Yangrel Nima Odzer's Terma biography of Padmasambhava was written probably 40 or 50 years later than Shamtung Tashi Dorje's biography. And we also notice that, of course, in Padmasambhava's biography, he comes from Odiyana. His son is a king. The place where he's born is Dhanakosha. So, we can understand that all of these stories, they kind of get borrowed back and forth. For example, in the Vajra Bridge, when Sri Singha goes to meet Manjushri Mitra, he sees Manjushri Mitra who's out in the field farming. And Manjushri Mitra is married. He's got a wife. The wife prepares food for Sri Singha. Well, this is very similar to the story of the founder of what's known as the Jnanapada Manju Vajra Guhya Samaj lineage. The Jnanapada lineage, which is the Budungyanapada, is an early Mahasiddha who lived is a contemporary of Padmasambhava's, actually. And the earlier, so now everybody's very familiar with this Akshobhya Guhya Samaj, which is practiced by the Gelugpas and the Norpas, and not so much by the Kagyus, but a little bit. And the Nyingmapas, maybe they practice, I don't know so much. But anyway, this story is a very famous story about how Budungyanapada meets Manjushri plowing in a field, and he's a little taken aback because monks aren't supposed to engage in agriculture. And then he finds out that this monk is married, and then he figures out that this monk actually is Manjushri in person, and this is how the Manjushri, or the sort of Manju Vajra lineage of Guhya Samaj starts. And so you see some elements of this story borrowed into the Vajra Bridge account, because Manjushri Mitra, Sri Singha travels to South India after very perilous adventures, and he meets up with this guy, this monk who's farming, who's married, who gives him booze, and Manjushri Mitra shows up drunk, and it's almost more or less the same elements as the Budungyanapada story. Anyway, that's not the most important point. The most important point is we see also that Garab Dorje's story of being born on Dhanakosha Island is earlier than the accounts of Buddha Padmasambhava being born on Dhanakosha. But of course, they both come from Odiyana. And so again, but we have different ideas about where Udayana supposedly is. Then, okay, so the next major theme, which we find in common with the Longde lineage and the Menakte lineage, but not the Semde lineage, is this idea that the nun was so freaked out, the princess nun was so freaked out and so miserable and frightened by having given birth to this child that she conceals the birth of this child from her father for 7 years. And the account is, I mean, of course, the details and everything are a little bit different, but in the Semde lineage, in the Jomo Menmo's lineage, Jomo Menmo's account anyway, we find that there's no trepidation, and that the king welcomes the grandchild right away. There's like no concern at all. King is convinced that the child is an emanation of a Buddha, Whereas in the Longde and Semde lineages, you know, the nun is she's very timid, and she's frightened and miserable and unhappy, and she doesn't really want to bring the child to her father, but eventually she does. And then when the king sees this child, like in the Menakte lineage, it's very funny, because what what the princess does is that they throw the kid into a pit full of ashes, and then they cover it up, right? And then they go back 3 days later to see whether the child is like survived or not, because, you know, they actually basically they tried to kill Garab Dorje because they were embarrassed, because this happens, you know. But we've heard many times women, you know, if they have a child born out of wedlock in ancient sort of situation, they're terrified that they're going to be punished for it, so they will kill the child. So basically what happens here is that Princess Sudara basically buries her child in a pit of ashes, and then they kind of go, and she and her attendant go back after 3 days, and then they see light, and they hear sound coming from the pit, and they find the child is in the pit laughing its head off and totally unharmed. You know, this is a kind of Mahasiddha story. You have to have this. This is like Moses in the basket sort of thing. But this doesn't happen in the Semde and Longde. In Semde and Longde, she just brings her child to the king, and the king is like, this is such a fantastic baby. Why didn't you show me my grandson before? And like this kind of thing. And in all of these, all three of these, another common element that they have is that Garab Dorje at a very young age feels compelled to challenge Panditas, you know, setting up the meeting for his meeting with the Manjushri Mitra and so on. Now, one of the things that's very interesting and a very quite different, and another difference between these, in the Menakte lineage, they don't mention what season of the year Garab Dorje is conceived in. But in the Semde lineage, they say that he was conceived on a full moon in the first day of autumn. Whereas the Longde lineage, they say that he was conceived on the full moon of the last month of spring. So there's another difference. So what we can see, we have all of these sort of very interesting elements in the story. The elements are very common, but the way they're treated by these different authors is completely different. Now, of course, if someone is faithful, devoted, not a Western scholar, you know, more or less, we just, whatever lineage we're hearing, we just accept that. We don't go into a lot of intellectual sort of analysis of these things. But if you're someone who has to do a presentation on these things and you have these different books, then you kind of have to somehow collate these different accounts, because they're completely different. And of course, we're told by our Tibetan teachers, if we have them, some of you may not be Tibetan Buddhists, I don't know. But we're told that none of these accounts are contradictory. We just have to forget about them being contradictory. They're just different points of view written by different people, different accounts that, you know, because we all have impure vision and partial vision, we can't really see everything totally clearly. So that brings me to, where does that bring me to? Another interesting thing about Garab Dorje then is how he goes out into the world. So Garab Dorje, basically in all of these accounts, he departs from home. And so, you know, in the Semde lineage, he decides that he's going to go to, it's a little unclear because it says in the first part that he's born on Danakosha Island, but then it says at the same time he wants to go to Danakosha Island to do retreat, where there is on the shores of the great outer ocean, and where he goes to a cave called Dandika in the Golden Cliff, where there's a great graveyard called the Great Joy that fills the Golden Isle, and he wants to go there to practice. And he says if he doesn't accomplish Dharma there, he just decides he has to go practice, even though he's like reciting the Dorje Semka Namkhai, he decides he has to go practice. So if he doesn't accomplish the Dharma there, then it's like the world is just a dream and it's meaningless. Then, of course, we have the account of Manjushri Mitra, but we don't really have time to go into that. Oh wait, no, maybe that was here we go. Oh no. I think we're missing a page. Oh yeah, here we go. Right. And then long day. Then same thing happens in the Menok day. So that was the long day account where he goes to the island of Dhanakosha. So then in the Menok day lineage, what happens is when he goes to Dhanakosha, it's a sort of an interesting description. He's there in Dhanakosha. Supposedly Dhanakosha is there's an explanation of the name where Da means sandalwood. And it's an island which is supposedly filled with jewels, but it's inhabited by beings who have human bodies, but they have the faces of bears and they have claws, sharp claws. So maybe like the Andaman Islanders or something, you know, there's these islanders in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And if you land on their island, they will kill you immediately. So here, maybe it's like one of those kinds of islands where there's these very fierce indigenous people who don't want to be disturbed, there's a lot of jewels on their islands and people are probably trying to go there, constantly plundering them. I don't know. Yeah. And so he goes there to do practice. And various other places. So anyway, the thing is about Garab Dorje is for us, particularly because there's these different stories of Garab Dorje. Garab Dorje is a very mysterious person for us because we don't really, actually, there's no, apart from these 12th century Tibetan accounts of Garab Dorje, we simply don't have really any other information about Garab Dorje except for some texts that are attributed to him in various different places. So I don't really have that much to add, and we're almost at an hour. So I suppose if anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to ask them. So we have one question so far. Is it correct to say that in comparison to Sunday and Upadesha series, the long day series contain far less practical instructions on how to do practices? Okay, well, this is a good question. The reason why it's a very good question is that the way the Vajra Bridge describes long day teachings is that it's it basically, okay, let's start over. There are two basic different accounts of the three series that we find in Tibetan Buddhism, in Dzogchen. There's the Vajra Bridge account of the three series, and then there's the Menok Day account of the three series. When we look at these things textually, we find in the 17 tantras, there's only one mention of three series, and that is in the Dratalgyur Tantra. And it doesn't actually identify what those three series are. However, in the Nangje Drunma, the Illuminating Lamp, which is the commentary by Vimala, it identifies very extensively what it calls the white space, the black space, and the variegated space. And it identifies a number of different positions of long day, and it identifies like 20 different positions of Sunday. But honestly, when you compare what is said, and by the way, Longchenpa, when he discusses long day and Sunday, he just literally cuts and pastes from this commentary of Vimala without altering a single word. So it seems unlikely that whoever wrote down the Nangje Drunma had that much contact with Longde, because there's no discussion in Longde itself of a white or a black or a variegated series. And the way I've seen it explained in some places that, and I don't have the order correct, so you'll forgive me if you read somewhere and you find out that I'm wrong, but basically it works like this. One of the series, basically you have the practice, but the view is in common with Semde. And then in another of the series, the practice is Longde and the view is Longde. And then in the third of the series, which I think is the variegated series, if I may be mistaken, the practice is like, you know, the sort of the four das, just a famous notion of practice in Longde, but the view is consistent with Menakde. This is sometimes how you see it explained. But in reality, in Longde, Kunzang Dorje identifies a different three series. He says there's Chude, Gyude, and Longde, and he identifies Longde as Dzogchen. Then you have the Tantra division, which is referring to Tantras like Mahayoga and Ati Yoga, and then you have the Sutra series. So that's how in Longde they understand this notion of three series. So it's a completely different idea, same term, completely different idea about what the three series actually are. So you can see at some point, sort of Tibetan scholars wanted to systematize everything, and they pretty much have overlaid Menakde schematics onto all of the Dzogchen teachings that were previously discussed. So these days, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to discuss Dzogchen without discussing Semde, Longde, and Menakde, even though this terminology is, although Longde does refer to itself as Longde, the place where this is actually systematized is in the Vima Nintig. So there's a text in the Vima Nintig, which is called the Yuyikchen, that is the turquoise letters. And in the Yuyikchen, it contains a bunch of historical information, which it claims is drawn from this tantra called the Ati Yoga, which was never translated by Vimalamitra into Tibetan, but supposedly left in Kashmir. And so then expanding on that, the Lokuchenmo basically asserts that Manjushri Mitra divided all of the 6.4 million shlokas, that is a 27 syllable verse, technically speaking, into these three series. And then, of course, later we find, like, for example, in a lot of Longchenpa's writings, a lot of statements to the effect that Longde and Semde are quite inferior to Menakde. And even in like the Vima Nintig Se Chikpagyud, there's a statement right in the beginning of the text where it says, you know, Semde is for intellectuals, Longde is for, you know, the spacious, and Menakde is for, you know, the people who are like really practicing, like that, something like that. Anyway, the main point here is that these days we can't discuss Dzogchen unless we're talking about Bunpo Dzogchen. And even then they use the term Semchok to describe Dzogchen in the Bunpo Katen. We can't really discuss Dzogchen without discussing the three series, because this schematic has become so overwhelming that it's impossible to have a discussion about Dzogchen without addressing, at least from the beginning, this notion of three series. Now, to answer your question directly, there's a lot of ambiguity around which tantras actually belong to Longde. So, for example, many people say, oh, well, there's no Tekchot and Togal in Longde. That just doesn't exist. That doesn't exist there. But this is a mistake because, for example, the root text of Longde is often considered to be the Longchen Rabjam Gyud. And the Longchen Rabjam Gyud mentions both Tekchot and Togal in that tantra. So we couldn't say then that there is no Tekchot and Togal in Longde, because the root tantra of that series, I mentioned these two phrases. That doesn't mean there's a lot of discussion of Tekchot and Togal in Longde. There isn't. They don't use this terminology. This is something which is unique and specific to Menakde. So anyway, so what Longde really is, what Longde really sort of articulates itself as is the Nagyud. Again, Na is Ranatana, the Nagyud, ear lineage of Dzogchen, as opposed to the textual lineage of Sem Chok that makes that distinction. So the Longde understands the so-called Semde, Sem Chok. Chok means also side or division, as just being a kind of a textual tradition, whereas Longde identifies itself as being the actual oral lineage of Vairochana through Yudra Ningpo and Pangmi Ponggampo, etc. And that's an important distinction. So really, Longde itself, there's a kind of a sort of desire to sort of ground it in a tantra, but I think this is kind of chasing something which doesn't really exist. That people try to like put, really the view of Longde is not different than Semde. Actually, honestly, the view of Menakde is not different than Semde either, if you really get right down to brass tacks. Anyway, so that's why this kind of question of like which tantras belong to Longde is very ambivalent and ambiguous. Then, what do you make of the presence of Garab master in the lineage of the 24 lineages of the Zhangjin Yenju? Well, I can't really make anything of that. I received also Zhangjin Yenju, and it's interesting that there's a Zhangjin Garab in the lineage, but Garab is actually kind of a common Tibetan name. So I don't think that we can really necessarily assume that Zhangjin Garab and Garab Dorje are the same person. In any case, they wouldn't have lived at the same time because the Zhangjin Yenju masters lived in the distant past. So I can't really answer that very well. It'd be speculative for me to make a claim one way or the other. The reason why people bring this up is that Norbu Rinpoche, in a text he wrote in the mid-70s, suggested in the Necklace of Z, which I think he wrote more as a broadside rather than something he really committed to, because we can see Norbu Rinpoche himself often says that in this human realm, Garab Dorje, the guy from Odiana, is the real origin of Dzogchen teachings. But anyway, there's nothing, there's two questions about this. There's nothing we can really say about Garab Dorje and the Bund tradition. I mean, the Bund tradition clearly borrows from Buddhism. There's no doubt about it. There's not that much that's borrowed back the other way. I've looked at a lot of Bunpo texts, and the Bunpo scholars, they'll be mad at me for saying so. But this is also the position of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche's point of view about Zhangjin Yenju is that only the 12 little tantras are the actual authentic words, this Nyengyud, etc., and that the rest of the Bunpo Zhangjin Yenju are later compositions, termas, and so on and so forth. So I think to say anything more than that is completely speculative. On the other hand, I think that Zhangjin Yenju is very worthwhile studying and practicing because the Dzogchen teachings in Zhangjin Yenju are perfect. They're beautiful, and in many ways, for example, when I first met Norbu Rinpoche, he pointed out that the teachings on Dra'u and Zer, sound, light, and rays, in the 6 lamps cycle, the inner cycle of Zhangjin Yenju, were much more comprehensive than this notion of Dra'u and Zer in Buddhist tantras, which is a much more confined presentation. But in the commentary on the 6 lamps and the Zhangjin Yenju, there's a very interesting, in-depth, and beautiful explanation of these principles. So to me, it doesn't matter so much exactly where this kind of idea of like, is Dzogchen originally from Zhangjin, or is it from Modian, or this is all kind of religious nationalism that I don't have much interest in because I'm not a nationalist, and I think that the meaning of all Dzogchen teachings is the same. Then how many different iconographic representations of Garab Dorje are common beyond the, this is an interesting question also, because this notion of Garab Dorje being a Heruka, this is a kind of modern, actually. If you look into traditional presentations of Garab Dorje going back almost as far as we can go. Now, Jakob Winkler sent me a very interesting kind of a Persian version of Garab Dorje that he thought if I was going to use pictures, I would use it, but I'm not using pictures because I want to hog the camera all for myself. I don't want to show pictures of other people, So anyway, the main point here is that mostly Garab Dorje is presented as a Nirmanakāya, like he's a monk. We know that this is impossible, really, because there's no record of Garab Dorje ever ordaining anywhere. And we know that he hung out in charnel grounds. So I personally believe that Norbu Rinpoche's depiction of Garab Dorje as a Heruka is a more accurate. But when we look at other presentations, we find out that that's true. Now, there is one thing I want to talk about, and I don't know if Professor Sanders addressed this, because I didn't really watch his presentation on the 12 primordial teachers, but I've written a bit about it, and I know a little bit about it. And one of the interesting things about people should really wonder why these 12 particular Buddhas are the most important Buddhas for Dzogchen. As many people don't really have any idea. The reason is very simple. And again, Jamyang, you can jump in if Fabian talked about this, but the reason is that normally Buddha Shakyamuni has 12 deeds. He descended from Tushi to heaven, he entered his mother's womb, etc. Then in his final deed was demonstrating parinirvana. But when we look at the Lokuchenmo, it discusses how the Buddhas who teach Dzogchen have 108 deeds. So how do they arrive at 108 deeds? For the Dharmakaya, there's 12 deeds of mind, there's 12 deeds of speech, and there's 12 deeds of body. For the Sambhogakaya, there are 12 deeds of speech, there are 12 deeds of, mind, 12 deeds of speech, and 12 deeds of body. And for the Nirmanakāya, there are 12 deeds of mind, 12 deeds of speech, and then the standard 12 deeds that Shakyamuni Buddha performed, which is why Shakyamuni Buddha is considered to be one of the masters who taught Dzogchen, even though he's considered to be one of the Buddhas related to Dzogchen, even though he never taught Dzogchen. And the reason why these Buddhas are considered, specifically these 12 Buddhas from Nangwa Dampa all the way down through Nunzuk Gyalpo and Kashyapa, etc., is because they have 108 deeds, which is 36 deeds each for each of the three kayas. That adds up to 108. And so that's why these 12 primordial Buddhas, starting with Nangwa Dampa, and then of course, and I don't know again if Professor Sanders mentioned this either, the reason why we have this is because in the previous eon, there was a guy who studied under 3 Buddhas and attained Buddhahood. And then after attaining Buddhahood, when we entered into a dark eon in the previous eon, before this Bhadrakalpa, this fortunate eon, when his Dharmakaya began to manifest, because sentient beings were beginning to manifest again out of this sort of state where the universe was in abeyance, if you will, then also he manifested as the Nirmanakāya Nangwa Dampa, and Nangwa Dampa taught all 1002 Buddhas of the fortunate eon. In addition to this, there's a very beautiful image in the commentary of the Nirmanakāya, where out of this firmament of 6.4 million stars, 17 of them are more brilliant than all the others. And these 17 stars are sort of an omen of the arrival of Nangwa Dampa's teaching of the 17 tantras. And everything, of course, everything else is Dzogchen, but in the Menakte tradition, they have like a specific program, agenda to push the 17 tantras as being the bee's knees of all Dzogchen teaching. So anybody else have any questions? Oh, how did Garab Dorje leave this dimension? Well, that's also a good question. So they don't really, so in the Sem Day and the Long Day, they don't really discuss so much how Garab Dorje rainbows out. That story is mostly in the Menakte tradition. And you can understand, another thing about Garab Dorje is that Garab Dorje shows up in the colophon of many of the Menakte tantras. So like when you get to the end of the teaching, or sometimes in the preliminary, for example, if you read my translation of the Self-Arisen Vidya Tantra, the Garab Dorje is right there as part of the retinue of Zhonopao Tobden, who is the teacher of the Rikbarang Shar, the Rikbarang Drol, and also one other tantra. I think it's the Dorje Sempa Ningi Melam, but I could be mistaken. Anyway, he's like responsible for teaching 3 of them or 4 of them or something like this. And so Garab Dorje shows up in the retinue of these other Buddhas who are teaching Dzogchen quite frequently. So the idea is that Garab Dorje was also a bodhisattva. And of course, this is non-contradictory because when you understand the idea of Mahayana, in Mahayana, you can have infinite numbers of emanations. Particularly if you're already a Buddha, you can have infinite numbers of emanations acting in an infinite number of ways. So you can be the teacher and the student at the same time. That's just standard in what's known as Sambhogakayas, for example. They also do the same thing. A Sambhogakaya, Sambhoga literally means to enjoy together. What are they enjoying together? So if a Buddha has no retinue, then the Buddha will emanate a retinue. Why? So he can explain the Dharma, so they can enjoy the Dharma together. But also they can emanate infinite numbers of Nirmanakāyas, like Garab Dorje. So Garab Dorje didn't leave this dimension, really, if you think about it, because Garab Dorje is also a Buddha. That doesn't mean we can see Garab Dorje, but Buddhas never leave. In Mahayana, we have this principle called non-abiding nirvana. So the only people who actually leave are arhats. And what they do is they go into a samadhi of cessation that they think is nirvana, but it's not really nirvana. And then according to the Lanka Avatara Sutra, then the Buddhists shine a light ray out and then they wake up, arhat number 530 million. And they say, hey, you have to join the bodhisattva path. And then they have to start the bodhisattva path at the beginning and continue, because otherwise it would be too easy to like just become an arhat and then then become an 8-stage bodhisattva, etc. So any other questions there? Not that many questions. Scriptural basis of long. Yeah, again, to revisit that question, the scriptural basis of long day is really the fact that it is a oral lineage, and these tantras, they don't really present anything very different than Semde. The actual view is basically Semde. So it's really the point of long day is the 4 das and the explanation, which is given by Rochna in the various intimate instructions connected to these, which is why I think Norbu Rinpoche, for example, never bothered to teach anything related. There's some tantras which are associated with the long day lineage, but no one really, I mean, they exist and there are commentaries on them and stuff like that, but people don't really spend too much time looking at these things anymore. The other thing that's very interesting about the notion of long day, so many people hear that long day is considered to be kind of a bridge between Semde and Menak day. This is a much later opinion, which actually comes from one of the Sharmapas, who wrote quite a bit on long day, because the Kagyus have always been very interested in long day because of the association between Zeng Dharma Bodhi and Gampopa. But what the Vajra Bridge actually says is that the text by Kunzang Dorje is that the Vajra Bridge is actually the lineage from Samantabhadra through Vajrasattva, Garab Dorje, Manjushri Mitra, all the way down to whoever your master was. And then one other big difference between long day and Semde, like Menak day, long day has a very short lineage. It goes from Garab Dorje to Manjushri Mitra to Sri Singha. Whereas in the long day lineage, we have Garab Dorje, Manjushri Mitra, Dahena Talu, we have Nagarjuna. There's 3 different Kukurajas in the Semde lineage. So it's like 21 masters. So it's said at the end of in the Lokuchenmo, it says that basically there are 7 generations. That is, there's 21 masters, and each group of 3 masters in that lineage is considered 1 generation. So there's 7 and then Vairochana added on the end makes an 8th generation. So between Vimala Mitra and Garab Dorje, there's 7 generations of teachers, meaning within 3 teachers giving each other teachings within 1 generation. So however long you think a generation is, there's no dates in Long Day and Menak Day. So are there any lineages of, yes, there are Mahayoga teachings that come from Garab Dorje. Garab Dorje, for example, if you look in the Nyingma Kama, he is responsible for, I think, the 6 face Yamantaka teaching that was one of Nubchen Nubsangye Yeshe's main practice. So Garab Dorje, also there's a Vajra that comes from Garab Dorje and a couple of other transmissions. So Garab Dorje wasn't just teaching Dzogchen, he was also, because Manjushri Mitra, he is mainly a Yamantaka practitioner. This is why he's called Manjushri Mitra, because his main yidam was Yamantaka. And so, he also received Yamantaka from Garab Dorje, and Yamantaka, interestingly enough, in the Nangje Drunma, the commentary on the Dratal Jor, there's three main deities which are discussed in that commentary. Vajrayogini, there's like 40 pages of commentary on Vajrayogini. Then Yamantaka, and there's maybe 15 pages of commentary on Yamantaka. And then Ācārya is mentioned as being a special deity for Dzogchen practitioners. And in fact, in the Menakde section of the Nyingma Gyudbum, there's also a very interesting little tantra called the Marichi Tantra, which is about Ācārya and has a kind of interesting information about working with sun, the meaning of sunlight, and it's a very interesting little text. I've been meaning to translate it for a long time, but I never seem to get around to it. Any more questions? Oh, similar to Jesus. Carol McQuire, she wants to know, this is kind of a funny question. A mother who has no other children, the dreams, animals impregnated a non-vaginal painless, well, that only happens in Semde, the non-vaginal painless birth. But okay, I mean, like, for example, if you ask my mom, I was born in 4 hours and she claims that there was no pain, that I just slipped right out like, I don't know, a suppository or something like that, zero pain. Okay, so some births are painless. You ask my mother, I mean, maybe my mother's totally deluded, but she really claims that when I was born, there was zero pain. So I don't know, and she wasn't on any drugs. Let me see. Yes, well, of course, Buddha also, he had an immaculate conception, right? I mean, his mother, Maya Devi, was impregnated by a dream of a 6-tusked white elephant. So, I mean, this idea, I'm sure that this idea is sort of very common in the ancient world. After all, we know that the first person who was called the Son of God was Alexander the Great, who went and he incubated himself in the temple of Zeus Orynthalis in Egypt, and he had this dream where Zeus appeared to him in a dream and said, "You're not the son of a human father, you're my child." And then we know that, for example, Augustus, who was born the same year as Jesus, roughly, also he was called the Son of God. So this Son of God idea, or Devaputra, okay, because that's literally what Devaputra means. Devaputra just means prince, and people take this kind of literally. Actually, so we have Devaputras, which are godlings, but actually the word Devaputra really means prince. So if you're a Devaputra, technically speaking, you can say, "Oh, I'm the son of God." So I think there's like a lot of these ideas floating around. And besides, if your mother is a nun, you really hope that she had an immaculate conception, because otherwise your mother is no longer a nun. That's a kind of a consequence of having sex if you're a bhikshuni or a bhikshu or anyone else for that matter. So let me see. Oh, Carol says, I had one painless birth too, no anesthetics. Well, so maybe your child's a special child, just like moi. Bhikshuni Nandi. Well, I can say a little bit more about Bhikshuni Nandi. Apparently, Bhikshuni Nandi gave the teachings at an inappropriate time. So there's a section in the Lokuchenmo where, as a result of her giving teachings, all kinds of calamities happen. And then they have to kind of go and sort of like sort everything out and eliminate this error. But other than that, I mean, all we really know about Bhikshuni Nandi is in the Zonglingma. I think it's in Zonglingma, or maybe it's in Orgyen Lingpa's bio. I can't remember. But she swallows Padmasambhava in the form of a hum, and then he issues out from her bhaga, polite term for the pudenda. Anyway, but if you've ever received any kind of Ācārya yoga empowerment, then you know that at one point during the empowerment, you dissolve and you turn into a seed syllable and you enter into the guru's mouth, and then you come out and go into the mother's space, and then eventually you come out and then you're Hey Vajra or whatever it is, deity. It's kind of standard procedure. Let me see. Any other questions? Or have I totally exhausted you?
I didn't find totally exhausted you on Apple Music.
Oh, see? That's funny. Okay, well, I guess that Siri just canceled us. No, anybody else have any questions? Seriously, I have time.
Malcolm, I do have a question.
Okay. Who's speaking? I can't see who you are.
Here.
Oh, yes.
I was wondering if, for example, with Padmasambhava, often a way that his teaching lineage is refreshed, termas come up periodically and sort of refresh and revitalize the tradition, especially from his 25 close disciples and their later reincarnations. I'm wondering if there is anybody close to Garab Dorje during his life, supposedly close disciples, who keep on coming back over the centuries and refreshing and continuing the lineage in any way.
Yes, I mean, Manjushri Mitra has a number of emanations. I think Sri Singha doesn't really have that many emanations. Vimala Mitra has many emanations, but Jnana Sutra doesn't. So it's a little hard. I think actually, I mean, I'm sure there must be an emanation of Sri Vairochana, of course, you know, has many emanations like Dorje Lingpa, Jamang Kongtrol. Our Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, I think we can safely say, is definitely an emanation of Vairochana. This is my personal opinion. So, you know, that doesn't make it so, but I really think so because of Norbu Rinpoche's work in restoring Semde and Longde to their previous glory. So yeah, the big ones in Garab Dorje's lineage are, generally speaking, Manjushri Mitra, Vimala Mitra, and Vairochana. Yeah, Jnana Sutra and Sri Singha don't seem to really have inspired that much interest, honestly, enough interest in Tibetans so that they would say that they were emanations. The other thing about Sri Singha, which people should understand, this whole idea that Sri Singha comes from China, this is strictly from the Lokuchenmo. There's no evidence at all, based on the Semde and Longde text, that Sri Singha was anything other than an Indian. Now, that doesn't mean he couldn't have come from some other place. For example, we know that Xuanzang traveled to India, learned Sanskrit very well, and was capable of, knew Sanskrit well enough that he was capable of debating at Nalanda. So it's quite possible that Sri Singha was a foreigner but it's very clear, at least in the Semde lineages, and Semde and Longde, it's very clear that Sri Singha was a resident of Nalanda. He wasn't, it's not like in the Vimanintig where, you know, Vairochana and Jnana Sutra have to travel to Gyanak, wherever that happened to be. And there's a lot of, you know, there's this guy named Barber who wrote his thesis on Vairochana and Sri Singha, and he really thinks that Sri Singha is in Central Asia. And then other people think that Sri Singha was at Angkor Wat in Southeast Asia, based upon their idea of what Gyanak is. But if you look at Longde and Semde lineages, there's really no evidence to suggest that Sri Singha was anything other than a Pandita living in India. And that's further confirmed by this Manjushri Kirti citation that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, because it would be a little strange for Manjushri Kirti to be discussing some scholar who lived outside of India. Although he does mention Kache, he mentions one scholar from Kashmir who, when we look up his name, we find out that I think it's Ananda Vajra, who collaborated, according, at least in the Nyingma Jidbum, collaborated with Padmasambhava on translating some tantras and so on and so forth, like that. And do any of the 84 Mahasiddhas practice Dzogchen or attain it? They don't need Dzogchen because they practice Mahamudra. So if you're Mahamudra and Dzogchen, it's the same. You can find the word Mahamudra in all the Dzogchen tantras, most of them. So if we look at these things, I think that this sort of, by the time we have Mahasiddhas, it's a little later, mostly, not completely. Saraha is quite early. Nagarjuna, quite early. Virupa, quite early, depending on who you follow. According to the Sakya tradition, Virupa was a contemporary of Padmasambhava, was actually invited by King Trisung Detsen to come to Tibet, but he was too busy conquering Shaivites in South India to really pay attention to that invitation. In terms of, Norbu Rinpoche said over and over again that the realization of Mahamudra and Dzogchen is the same because it's Buddhahood. The Bunpos, they say something else. They say that the realization of Dzogchen is higher than Mahamudra, and they have their reason, but that's not Norbu Rinpoche's point of view. I don't personally know. I have no idea, but I do know that if you read Sri Singha, if you read Saraha and you compare it with what Sri Singha says, there's not that much difference. Then a Burmese statue of Sri Singha, yes, that's possible. The Norbu Rinpoche, it's very possible. I don't know. But this idea is mentioned, somebody, Raphael Kalef, mentions this, that Norbu Rinpoche said he saw a Burmese statue of Sri Singha. Yeah, this is a common idea. It's based on the Lokuchenmo. So I can't, is this Mahamudra like Sutra Mahamudra? If you read Jaman Kongtrul, Jaman Kongtrul makes it very clear that so-called Sutra Mahamudra is for those people that Gampopa judged to be incapable of practicing Vajrayana. So he taught them shamatha and vipassana, which was articulated through the Upadeshas of the Mahasiddhas, actually. But Kongtrul makes it very clear that Sutra Mahamudra, as he understands it, were for people that Gampopa judged to be incapable of practicing secret mantra. So anyway, one thing important, and how does Garab Dorje? Oh, so Alexei Polinov. So Garab Dorje didn't originate a thing. This is what we have to understand. The Garab Dorje was a Nirmanakāya. So very simple, in the same way, for example, in the Lotus Sutra, the Siddharma Pundarika, the Buddha says there that he heard the Siddharma Pundarika many eons ago. Now, when he taught it again on Vulture Peak, he was merely basically repeating a sutra that he himself had heard. So Garab Dorje, the first teacher to teach all of the Dzogchen Tantras was Nangwa Dampa. And interestingly enough, if you read the Namtars and so on and so forth, the language that Nangwa Dampa taught the 17 Dzogchen Tantras and all the other 6.4 million shlokas of Dzogchen was in the language of birds. It very specifically says this in the Lokuchenmo. And the language changes with each teacher who teaches. So we have to understand that the language is not, it's not like they were teaching in Sanskrit or Tibetan or the language of Odiyana always. They were teaching in the language of Dakinis, the language of Dakas, Yakshas, et cetera, like this. Any source of information on Goma Devi besides those from Semde? Nope, there's zero information about Goma Devi except for in the Drabat Chenmo. She's not even mentioned in the Longde lineages, actually. So this is a very specific tradition from the Semde tradition. And then, so all the three series, they don't originate with Garab Dorje. As I mentioned before, Manjushri Mitra was the one who supposedly divided them up into the three series. And so that's, Garab Dorje didn't do anything original at all. Not one thing. Buddhists don't do anything original. They just teach. That's it. Anything else? The Garab Dorje had many female disciples. That is, if you consider Dakini's disciples. In fact, most of Garab Dorje's disciples would be Dakinis, not men. And so in Dzogchen teachings, we say that more women will achieve realization than men through Dzogchen teachings, because the main protector of Dzogchen teachings are Ekajati, along with the three sisters. Their three sisters is not well known, but anyway, in the Vajra Bridge account, there are these three Dakinis in this charnel ground who voluntarily declare that they wish to protect Dzogchen teachings, and we can find the Torma offering for those 3 dakinis. It's like in the Gongpa Zangtel, for example. There's like Ekajati, and then there's these 3 other dakinis, etc. If one gets a Dzogchen initiation, then doesn't practice it, is it considered breaking Samaya? Well, if you get a Dzogchen, if you receive, I mean, from a Dzogchen point of view, if you receive Dzogchen teachings and then you don't practice them, actually, as long as you have faith in Dzogchen teachings, it's stated this very clearly in many texts. Even if you only have faith in Dzogchen teachings but never practice at all, you'll be guaranteed to be reborn in the family of a family that practices Dharma. So there's never any downside to receiving Dzogchen teachings. And if you don't practice Dzogchen teachings, having received a Dzogchen initiation, in my opinion, as you don't hate the teacher and you love the Dharma, etc., then you can't break Samaya. Is there any benefit from receiving empowerments from multiple Dzogchen cycles if one has already received the pointing out? Okay, so now then, that's an extremely good question. So it really depends upon you. Now, if this is why if you really receive if you receive pointing out instruction and now you perfectly understand Dzogchen teachings, that means you have nothing left to do because you've gone, according to the way it's the 3 phrases go, you've gone beyond doubt, and you've decided on one thing, and then you can continue in the confidence of liberation. But if you're like most people who don't really understand the meaning of direct introduction the first time they receive it, then you have to practice many methods such as Semzins and Rushens. And if you're a person who's inclined to doing Mantrayana practice, then you can do mantra practice. But of course, the main point of Dzogchen teachings, as is stated over and over again in the Longde teachings, is the method of achieving Buddhahood instantly by understanding the meaning of Dharmata. And so, for example, Manjushri Mitra says in the Chanchub Semgom, he says, if you're a person who can't understand the direct Dzogchen directly, then there's the indirect method of reciting the essence mantra, for example, like the mantra of Yamantaka, and then elevating your entire experience to the level of Dharmata, so that while you're reciting that mantra, you're resting in the state of Dharmata emptiness. If you can do that, then maybe you don't need any further kinds of teachings. But also, there's many different lineages of teachings, and there's many different methods of giving pointing out. And so it can be very beneficial to receive Semde, Longde, Menakde, even Mahayoga empowerment. So for example, Norbu Rinpoche says, if you're a serious Dzogchen practitioner, you should receive the empowerment of Guya Garba. You should receive the empowerment of Ati Yoga, at least if you can't receive anything else, Ati Yoga empowerment of Vajrasattva, and you should at least at minimum receive the 5 family empowerment of the Khandro Nintig. That's what he says. It's Takchok Chiktu trade, to decide on a single point. Takchok Chiktu trade, that means decide on one thing. That's literally what it means. But Norbu Rinpoche is translating according to the meaning. The meaning is, if you've decided on one thing, you are no longer in doubt. So we have to understand that they're both correct translations. There's no contradiction between this. So Takchok Chiktu trade, or so decide one thing, or remain without doubt, the meaning is the same. Yeah, I mean, Norbu Rinpoche, he has his own understanding and way. Like, for example, many people are confused because Norbu Rinpoche says, oh, the 3 statements of Garab Dorje belong to the 3 series. So direct introduction belongs to Semde, remaining without doubt belongs to Longde, and continuing in that state, or continuing in the confidence of liberation, belongs to Menakde. But this teaching is unique to Norbu Rinpoche and comes from his dream. So you're never going to find any other teacher who's going to teach in this way. That's just how it is. And he mentions this himself. It's like the melody for Song of the Vajra. They don't use this melody. For example, they do use Song of the Vajra in the Choling Tersar during Gana Pujas, but they don't say, they don't use that sort of sonorous kind of like Amazing Grace melody that we use in Dzogchen community. Let me see. Who are the 3 sisters? Good question. I don't have the name memorized. All I know is that in the long day tradition, it mentions their names, and it mentions that these three Dakinis volunteered to Garab Dorje to be protectors of the Dzogchen teachings, and that those three sisters show up in this Gongpa Zangtal Dharma cycle. And the benefit from receiving many different teachings of Dzogchen teachings is you receive the transmission from many different Dzogchen texts. And in these days, basically, we're not so smart. So for us, we need more texts. Basically, the way it works is like this. In the beginning, one of the reasons why Vimalamitra did not translate the Ati Yoga into Tibetan, so it is said, is because he was afraid that if he translated this huge Tantra into Tibet, the Tibetans would just spend all of their time focusing on studying the Tantra. And similar reasons are given for the Buddhas withdrawing the Chakrasamvara Tantra in 500,000 lines, and Hey Vajra Tantra in 500,000 lines, and the Kala Chakra in 500,000 lines, is that people would just spend all of their time studying books and never doing practice. Now we have so many Dzogchen books that really this is also a danger again. We can spend all of our time reading books and never doing practice. So I think there's benefit to receiving multiple transmissions, but other people's mileage may vary. So I can't speak for everybody. Okay. Good if I wrap up. One last question. Better be a good one. No last questions. Oh, do I intend to translate any of the long day texts? What is my perfect Sunday? Well, I've translated a large portion of the Vajra Bridge, the main text, and I kind of got bogged down after Zeng Dharma Bodhi's Namtar. But I will continue. I will finish that eventually. But I'm not promising when, because my next project is the commentary on the Dratal Jor, which I'll be beginning in the fall. What if there are seeming contradictions in there is no contradiction in meaning. There's only differences of lineage. That's it. That's it. No difference in meaning between one Dzogchen teaching and another. You do have some people who develop sectarian attachments to Dujum Tersar, and then they're like, for them, the only Dzogchen teachings that's valid is like, Dujum Lingpa's teachings or Longchen Nintig or whatever. But this is sectarianism. This isn't something concrete or serious. There's no contradiction between any of the Dzogchen teachings actually at all. All right. And my perfect Sunday is one where I have Prosecco and I can relax and have some, charcuterie by the water somewhere in the shade, because direct sunlight doesn't work for me. But that's a perfect Sunday. Okay. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for getting together to watch me blather on about things that I don't know nearly enough about, but trying to learn more. And hopefully I contributed a little bit to your understanding of the Garab Dorje. I'm sure that there's people who can do a much better job than me, but anyway, I've done my best. And I hope you all have a fantastic Thursday. That's right. Since I work at home, I often don't know what day it is. And take care.